So it's my great honor to introduce to you Dr. Anna Walker from Bath Spa University. And as the slide already reads, she's the reader in creative enterprise and innovation, specializing in creativity and innovation at work. How it is managed, e.g. team diversity, organizational culture, and how it is measured. And Anna has maintained close links with industry ever since. Her academic qualifications include a PhD in creativity, innovation, and organizational culture from Manchester Business School. She has an MSc in organizational psychology from the Manchester Business School and her BSc in psychology at the University of Surrey. She also has interesting professional memberships. She is a fellow of the Higher Education Academy, and also she is a member of the British Psychological Society. So it will be thrilling to actually hear about the psychological aspects of innovation and COVID as we go through the presentation. So over to you, Anna, for what will promises to be a fascinating subject.
Thank you very much. I'm actually just going to hide the thumb, or actually just see if I can move those over. Nope. Okay, I'm just going to hide the thumbnails a little bit so that you can see the slides. Yep, so thank you, Andreas. So as Andreas said, I'm at Bath Business School at Bath Spa University, where I'm a reader in creative enterprise and innovation. And again, as Andreas said, essentially my background is as a psychologist. So I focus on innovation and on creativity in the workplace, but coming at it from a psychological perspective. So really just coming at it from thinking about who are the people involved in the process and how can we best manage and facilitate the people within that process. In addition to the academic background, I also kind of work alongside that with organizations advising on how to manage innovation at a kind of broad strategic level, but also sometimes on specific innovation projects as well. And then in that case, primarily within highly regulated industries. And most recently, unsurprisingly, perhaps the focus has been on COVID and essentially asking the question, is COVID changing the way that organizations go about innovation? And that's what I'm going to focus on today. So there'll be a few slides that I'll talk through. And then, as Andreas said, there'll be time at the end for questions and answers, and I look forward to whatever questions you may have. So there's three kind of main sections that we're going to talk about today. So we're going to start off with a little bit of background about essentially why this is an important topic and kind of what we know so far. Then I'm going to share with you some specific findings, basically from a piece of research that I've been undertaking recently that specifically looks at how COVID is changing how organizations go about innovation. And once we've talked through those findings, we'll then draw some conclusions and briefly discuss how we can move forward from the point that we're now at. And then, as Andreas said, then we'll have time for questions at the end. So that is the plan for today's session. So first things first, in terms of background, what we kind of know so far, and certainly what we knew before I was inspired, as it were, to try and to do my own research in this area, like in COVID specific, and how it relates to innovation, was that we were starting to see a number of reports emerging last year, so in 2020, where mostly big consultancies were starting to say, you know, yes, COVID is changing how organizations innovate. And there were some early indications that there were some kind of that the changes were focused on some specific areas. And what we were starting to see was that organizations were prioritizing speed, perhaps unsurprisingly, everyone was taken by surprise by COVID occurring, and suddenly organizations and governments as well were saying, we need to do something to react to this issue quickly. So there was a kind of a feeling that speed was really being emphasized much more than it has previously been, or much more than it normally is. And there was also a feeling that organizations were potentially starting to be more radical. And again, when I say organizations, that can include profit making, but also not for profit, and potentially kind of governmental organizations as well. That they were also starting to embrace kind of radical ideas, or more radical ideas than they previously would have. And the third thing that really emerged from the reports that I was reading early last year were that organizations were also starting to consider partnering with other organizations that they maybe previously wouldn't have worked with. So there are a number of themes that were starting to emerge from places like Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey and Harvard Business Review as well. And I've put the little you can see a footnote at the bottom of that slide with those in-text references for anyone who wishes to follow those up. So essentially, we started seeing some early reports of, yes, there are changes coming, and some early indications of what those changes may be. The issue was, for me, when I was reading those, was that pretty much all of that discussion, if not most of the discussion, focused very much on an American context. And, I was interested in the UK context. And I was also specifically then interested in whether the things that I was reading from America, whether they could be generalized, whether they were the same things that were happening here in the UK. And so really I wanted to know, what is the perspective of leaders who are working in a UK context, and what do they think about how COVID is changing how their organizations innovate? Is it having an effect? Is it not? And if it is having an effect, which I kind of guessed or thought that it would, but what effect is it having? And is that replicated, or is it replicating what the initial findings from America, for example, are suggesting? So that's kind of a bit of background and really the thought process that led me to engage in a piece of research that I will share the findings of now. So in order to understand from a UK perspective how COVID is impacting innovation in organizations, we conducted a series of interviews, and 26 of them to be precise. And we focused on leaders and senior managers, primarily, well, actually in this case, in these set of interviews, entirely within a healthcare context. That was because if you looked around at all of the industries that were facing change, one of the industries that was facing the biggest change, I would argue, was healthcare. And obviously a very, suddenly, healthcare is always an important industry, but it suddenly becomes even more important and topical when you're in a pandemic situation. So we then said, okay, let's talk to leaders and senior managers, specifically within a healthcare context, but within organizations. And let's ask them about their experience so far of COVID, and how their organizations are being impacted. So we spoke to 6 women and 22 men, like I say, all in senior management or leadership positions in healthcare organizations. And most of them were private sector, but not all of them. but most of them were private sector, or representing the private sector organisations, so profit-making organisations. And there were also a few people representing professional bodies as well. And that was particularly interesting because they're obviously able to speak for such a wide variety of organisations that they come into contact with. So it was great to have them on board as well and have that diversity within the sample. We also spoke to a quite a big range of organisations. So we had a lot of different sizes actually represented. So we had some organisations that were fewer than 10 people, and we also had, for example, one organisation that had more than 200,000 employees. So we kind of got a good representation of a whole series of different types and sizes of organisation. And just to give you a feel, so of those 26 interviews, which were mainly, almost all of them were from different organisations, and 15 of those organisations were SMEs. So, kind of roughly speaking, we would say half of the sample, half of the people we spoke to were from SMEs and half of them were from larger organisations. So what we then did is we conducted a series of interviews and then conducted some did some thematic analysis to understand what the main themes were. So really all that means is as academics speak for, we did some robust academic analysis of the data, of that qualitative data, and we try to work out, okay, what are the main things that are coming out of this data, and what, therefore, how can we answer the question of how is COVID-19 impacting innovation within organizations? What are people saying most commonly about that? So that kind of gives you, I think, a brief an overview and hopefully a little bit of an understanding about what we did. And what we found was a number of things. So we found 7 main themes emerged from the data. So what that means is that there were, if you ask that question, actually I'll just go back to this slide briefly. If you ask that question of how is COVID-19 impacting innovation in organizations, there were 7 main things, as it were, that emerged from asking that question and asking questions related to that. So 7 main key things emerged, and I'll go through and kind of give you a summary really of those 7 things now. So the first of these themes that we identified is surrounding radical innovation. Now, this wasn't a big surprise actually, because as I mentioned at the beginning in that background slide, some of the previous things that had been written about, for example, in America, about what kind of changes they were seeing, companies being more radical was one of those things. So I wasn't overly surprised that radical innovation came up as a theme. But what was interesting, I thought, was that although most of the people we spoke to, so bear in mind, most of these senior managers and leaders of these organizations, most of them were saying, yes, COVID has changed how radical we are when we go about innovation. But what was really interesting was that there wasn't really that consensus about whether it had made them more radical or less radical. And so people were consistently talking about how radical they were, but some were saying, yep, it's made us more radical. And others were saying, actually, this has made us less radical. And I've included 2 quotes here because I think they really nicely demonstrate the kind of dichotomy, or they demonstrate the 2 perspectives that emerged. So on the one hand, we've got organizations saying things like, yes, we want to push boundaries. We've gone through this crisis. We've seen what we're capable of as an organization. The world is changing, so it's a great time to change and improve as a business rather than just do the same old thing. So to me, when I hear that quote, it makes me think, yep, they want to push themselves further. They want to at least be open to being more radical in their innovation. But then on the flip side, we also had a number of interviewees saying things like the innovative projects were shelved, the less radical projects were continued. And actually this was driven by customers because the customers wanted the less risky projects. And there's kind of an inherent assumption there that that the less radical projects are also less risky. And obviously the flip side then as well, that the more radical projects are more risky, or riskier even. So that I think for me was the first interesting finding, that yes, how radical you are was a really hot topic, to put it in a very non-academic terms, but there was a real inconsistency in companies' experience of whether this COVID had made them more or less radical. And the people that said or implied that they had become less radical, when I probed them as to why that may be the case, why is it that your organization is now less radical as a result of COVID? And there were a number of themes that came, or kind of main points that were made when I asked that question. So to some extent, people were saying, we're less radical because actually we don't have the opportunity anymore. Our kind of boundary pushing radical innovation projects have been stopped or they've been paused. And so we just don't have the opportunity to engage in that kind of radical innovation at the moment because essentially the company is putting up barriers to stop us doing that. There were also some people that were saying that although the projects themselves, for example, the more radical projects themselves were still going, that the culture of the company had somewhat changed and there was actually an increased risk aversion within the organization now. And I thought that was very interesting. So that although in theory, those potentially very radical innovation projects were still going, actually, the reality of it was that the company wouldn't really support them in the same way as they would have done before. So there was a perception of greater risk aversion than there was previously. And the last point I found really interesting, again, as someone who's working from home myself now all the time, that some people were commenting that actually they thought that working from home was making them less radical, basically was making them less likely to engage in those more out there, for want of a better phrase, ideas. And with those people that mentioned that, when I probed them further, what they were saying was things like, I usually have an informal chat with a colleague if I've got an idea in my head, but I think it's a little bit, a bit weird or a bit unusual, then I perhaps run it past a colleague informally, having a chat with them over a coffee or something in the office, and get a sense for it that way, and kind of maybe we'll move on and do that, with a few people that I work with, to essentially very informally spread the word about my new unusual idea, or to very informally get a bit of feedback about, do people think that I've completely lost the plot, or actually this is something worth pursuing. And I thought that was really interesting, and I can, for me anyway, totally imagine that that's the case. You've got an idea, it's quite out there, you're a little bit maybe unsure therefore whether it's just completely weird or actually there's a spark of genius there, and you want to run it past your colleagues and maybe your friends informally, and it's quite hard to do that when you're not bumping into people physically in the same way that you would if you're working with them. So there was definitely a kind of an environmental aspect, essentially, of the physical environment that we're in is therefore also impacting how radical people feel that they can be. Okay, so leaving radical innovation aside for a minute, the Second main theme that or that was identified, and again, remember, we're answering this question of, is COVID changing how we innovate? And I think already we can see, just from looking at that first theme, we can see, yes, COVID is changing how we innovate. But then the question becomes, well, how is it changing it? And so we talked a bit about, it's impacting how radical we can be, whether that's making us more or less radical, but it's also impacting the speed at which organizations are innovating. Now, this was probably quite unsurprising, given, I guess, just what you read, in the press, and also having read reports from other from consultancies, for example. It didn't come as a big surprise that most interviewees, most people that we spoke to, so most leaders, were saying their organization is trying to innovate more quickly than it previously had, or than it usually does. And there are a number of different reasons for that. That increased speed is partially because organizations were seeing a commercial opportunity, and they wanted to take advantage of that opportunity quickly. It had a distinct, there was a distinct window there, and they wanted to take advantage of that. So, for example, PPE market, was suddenly significantly bigger and more important than it was before. So, for example, some of the organizations I spoke to were trying to rapidly go after PPE opportunities that weren't really so prominent before. There were also a number of leaders that were saying that actually their organizations were now faster at innovation because of the number of barriers that had been removed. And those barriers were things like, it was easier to get hold of colleagues, perhaps, ironically, given you're not sitting physically with them, but it was maybe easier to get hold of people. People were more willing to talk to you or to talk to each other. And it was perhaps also easier to get in touch with other organizations as well that you might want to work with. Another thing that came up quite a bit was about communication being better as well. And that was quite interesting because a number of people were saying that their meetings have got shorter but more frequent. And actually having shorter, more frequent project meetings for innovation projects, they found was facilitating them to work at a faster pace than before. So in short, yes, COVID has made organizations faster, I would say, in terms of how they approach innovation. And there's a number of reasons for that, but essentially, yes, and companies are generally saying that it's making them faster, which I guess overall is a good thing. However, and unfortunately there is a however, there were a minority of interviewees that were saying that they found innovation had actually slowed down for them. And although this was a minority, those people, I thought anyway, they were noticeably frustrated at the fact that I guess they were looking around them, the rhetoric is all about speeding up, and yet their perception was that actually for them, innovation had really slowed down. And again, that was for a number of reasons. So perhaps their organizations didn't have the resources anymore to support them in the same way. Perhaps they were also having difficulties, bear in mind this is a healthcare context, accessing the NHS, for instance, for some initial discussions about new products that they wanted to have. So there were definitely some people reporting a slowdown in innovation for their companies, mainly for resourcing and access reasons. And again, I've put a quote here because I think it's always nice to hear it from the leaders themselves and, from the people we spoke to. And one person was saying, for them, innovation has pretty much stopped because it's just not possible to have those initial discussions that they needed to have to get those ideas off the ground. So a mixed bag in terms of speed, but most people were reporting things were speeding up. there is a question that, or there was a feeling, I would say, that whether innovation was perceived to be speeding up or slowing down seemed to depend a little bit on the stage of the particular innovation project that they were talking about, or the type of project. And this is something that, although the interviewees didn't really comment on this, if you looked at all of the interviews together, holistically, there was kind of an undercurrent, I would say, of where it seemed to, the speed of innovation seemed impacted by the nature of the project and the stage of the project. And by that, what I mean is that organizations seem to prefer later stage projects to early stage projects. And that could be potentially increased risk aversion that I mentioned previously that some interviewees had commented on. So my impression was that although most people said innovation was speeding up, it was a specific type of projects that were speeding up, and it was tending to be the later stage, lower risk projects that were speeding up. And yeah, again, some projects were being massively prioritized and some were being completely deprioritized. And I think, again, that is kind of consistent with what we were talking about earlier in terms of radical innovation as well, and to what extent that's welcomed or not. Okay, so if we then think about the third of the 7 themes that we found, so bear in mind, again, when I talk about these 7 themes, what I'm saying is, when we asked the question about, is COVID changing how organizations innovate, there were 7 main kind of key things basically that came up that people talked about. Seven main ways in which organizations were changing how they innovate because of COVID. And the third of those reasons, the third of those ways in which organizations were changing how they innovate because of COVID, was related to social purpose. Now, this was a really interesting one, actually, because if you think about social purpose, and it is quite a nebulous concept, it's quite an intangible concept, but here we're talking about organizations emphasizing doing good for the community, for example, that kind of thing. A little bit, some overlap there with corporate social responsibility, perhaps. And there was, I would say anyway, my perception was there was a lot of talk about this kind of thing in the media and kind of popular, discussion. So not necessarily an academic perspective, but in the media, for example, there was a lot of talk about how organizations were working together in new ways, and how everyone was coming together. And you remember there was quite a lot of talk about almost a wartime effort. And I remember that at the time there was quite a bit of discussion about whether it was appropriate to use war kind of metaphors and things like that. So this kind of social giving back concept seemed quite prominent to me. But what was interesting was that it wasn't that prominent in the interview. So it wasn't that prominent with the leaders that I spoke to, actually. However, everyone had something to say about it, but it was kind of, everyone said a few sentences about how their organization was going above and beyond in some way, but then actually, everyone quite quickly moved on to talk about other things that were more pressing, I guess, for them as an organization in terms of their innovation. But still, I thought it was quite promising that, we had a number of people saying things like, we had to move away from thinking that that we need to make a profit, and instead we need to think about what we can do to help. And if you think, in the context of, we're talking primarily about profit-making healthcare organizations, to have someone in a leadership position in that context saying, actually, what, we weren't focused on profit. People were telling me things like they're shipping products that are loss-making, for instance, that kind of thing. That they were really had moved away. I mean, that's a big shift, I would imagine, to go from we're a profit-making organization to saying, actually, you know what, profit isn't the most important thing for us at the moment. And, you know, that's a big change. That's a big change. So, yeah, this was a consistent thing between interviews, but it just didn't emerge as the most important from speaking to people. And what I thought was also interesting was that a few people had said that actually they had hoped to see much more focus on social purpose and on doing good and giving back to the community and those kind of things, that people would hope to see more of that than they had actually seen. So there was a bit of a sense there of potentially missed opportunity as they saw it. Okay, so we then move on and we look at collaboration. So collaboration is the kind of the fourth thing that emerged in terms of how organizations are changing, how they go about innovation. And with collaboration, there were a number of different things that came up. Actually, as you can see, because this slide is quite text heavy compared to the others. But one thing that emerged quite strongly was about inter-organizational collaboration. So what I mean by that is collaboration between different organizations. Where you've got different organizations or multiple organizations working together. And that was nice, actually. That emerged really strongly as one of the positives, one of the main positives, was a lot of interviewees, and so a lot of senior managers and leaders were saying, you know, actually, as a company, we're starting to work with, with more organizations, like more other companies than we would usually work with. And what was nice, actually, I thought, was that, you know, they're very open to saying, actually, you know, it hasn't always worked. We have had some mixed success with that, but we're taking the risk and we're trying it anyway. And I really, I liked that. I thought it was nice that people were acknowledging that actually it doesn't always have to work. But the fact that they were trying, just that in itself obviously means that it's more likely to work than if you don't even try. So, and given the risk is such an inherent part of innovation, I thought it was great that organizations were being open to that risk, seeing as often that's a challenge. So there was more collaboration between different organizations, but also very specifically, and again, something that I thought was very positive, was that organizations were tending to have engaged with different types of organization, like other collaborators, than they usually would. So we were seeing and hearing, anecdotes and stories about companies who were working with other companies that they never would have dreamed of working with before. So, for example, we're talking about healthcare companies working with non-healthcare companies that they really just wouldn't have looked at before, frankly. And we're now saying, you know what, actually, we're more open to who we work with. And if you can bring something of value to us and we can bring something of value to you, then let's give it a go. And, that attitude is, certainly in my experience, was not always, was often not there before. And that did seem to genuinely be something that had changed as a result of COVID. So that was a positive change, I felt. In addition to working to different companies working together, there was also an increase in collaboration in terms of collaboration within an organization as well. And a number of people commented on how essentially, although they didn't always use this language, essentially they were saying that the silos within their organization were decreasing, were coming down. The walls, the metaphorical walls between divisions or functions or departments or teams even, were coming down. And again, from an innovation perspective, that can only be a good thing, right? So I thought that was also a good takeaway and was good news. And I really liked this quote that I've got on the slide here, where someone was saying to me, you know what, after 3 months of sitting at home, So this was obviously, this was a little while ago now. After 3 months of sitting at home, you forget why you're doing things in this way. And, you're just doing it because it's tradition. But for example, why don't we invite that specific function, or could be team or department, to this meeting? Why don't we invite them? Okay, we never have, but actually, why not? Why don't we do it? It could be helpful. And I really liked it because they were starting to question themselves and say, actually, why are we doing things this way? Yes, it's always been done that way, but there might be a better way of doing it. And let's try and bring in some of my colleagues, for example, from across the organization that I usually just wouldn't think to include them, but actually, could be really useful and valuable to include them. So the fifth main theme that emerged when we're talking about how COVID is changing how organizations innovate is very specific to healthcare, as you will see. So we're talking about NHS now. And this is where you can really see the fact that we were talking to healthcare leaders. But I thought it was interesting to share nonetheless. And again, one of the things that emerged was that actually people were quite consistently raising the issue of there being barriers to innovation within the NHS. But again, a bit like the radicalness, actually, everyone said, yes, this is a topic, everyone wanted to talk about it, but people were quite inconsistent in terms of what they had to say about it. So some organizations were perceiving there to be fewer barriers now to innovation in the NHS than there were before. And actually they were saying, in their experience, innovation adoption is now quicker and more open in the NHS than they had ever seen it before. Conversely, other people were saying, we can't get in, we can't talk to the people we need to talk to, we can't have those initial discussions that we need to have in order to check that our ideas make sense from a clinical perspective. And from there, they perceived therefore that there were more barriers now to innovation in the NHS. So, again, this was something that everyone wanted to talk about, but people had very different experiences. And in terms of why that might be, to be honest, it seemed like it depended very much on the organization, and also it depended on how early or late stage the project was. So again, that's something I mentioned earlier, that that basically early stage projects were not so welcome, either within private sector companies, but also perhaps within the NHS. And later stage projects were perhaps more welcome. Although of course there's always there's always situations that don't fit with that, but that seemed to be a general trend that I was seeing. Okay, so the penultimate theme that was identified, so the kind of penultimate finding really in terms of how organizations are changing the way they innovate as a result of COVID, relates to innovation culture. So when I say culture, I mean, to what extent is the environment that people work in supporting them to be creative and to be innovative? Because as we know, it's all well and good having the right, in inverted commas, the right people. So people who are maybe open-minded and who want to engage in innovation. It's all well and good having those people, but if the environment of the organization doesn't encourage them or doesn't support them, or even worse, sometimes actively hinders them, then innovation just isn't going to happen. So it's an absolutely essential precursor, I would say, or facilitator, to have a culture of innovation. And by that, I'm talking about things like, are you an organization that is willing to take some risk? Is this an organization that has cohesive teams where people trust each other and are willing to share ideas with each other, even if they seem silly? Do they think that they're going to be laughed at if they suggest something? And that, that may sound that may sound silly, but I spend a lot of time talking to organizations about innovation culture, and that comes up, really does come up a lot, that frankly, and often in that language as well, that people say, what, I just don't want to be laughed at. I need to trust my team members that they're not going to laugh at me when I suggest things. So, having that kind of environment where people trust the people they work with, essentially, and work in that cohesive space are really important. Alongside other factors like obviously having leadership that is supportive and having clear goals in terms of innovation. So, innovation, its culture itself is a massive topic, but that was also something that therefore perhaps unsurprisingly emerged, that people were commenting on whether their organization was taking risks or not, and that's something we've talked about already a bit. Also whether they as leaders were able to support the people that were working with and for them. And I think the short version is that these leaders, they really wanted to support the people that were working for them to engage in creativity and innovation, and sometimes they felt empowered to encourage people to do that, and sometimes they didn't feel empowered in that way. But whichever way you look at it, innovation culture emerges again as an absolutely critical factor. And so just to share some examples of things that I heard that I really liked, because it's always nice to share the kind of the best practice that you hear. And genuinely, some of the leaders that I spoke to were really inspirational, actually, in terms of their culture that they were creating. So, I had leaders saying things to me like, we were really making it clear that jobs will not be lost at this time. And, given that environment where lots of people were furloughed, lots of people were being made redundant, that was a big statement to say, we guarantee that your jobs will not be lost. And just giving people that sense of security, if you can, and obviously not every organization can do that, but giving that sense of security is something that that will help, obviously, in terms of people feeling safe in order to start engaging in innovation again. Because I would imagine that if you're worried that you're imminently going to lose your job, then engaging in radical innovation projects probably isn't your top priority. And the other thing that I really liked that I heard was about leaders making it clear that failure would be accepted. And the only caveat there was that it wasn't always clear whether that was failure will be accepted during this time, as in during COVID, or whether it was a permanent, blanket statement that failure would always be accepted. That wasn't always quite clear, but I think either way, that moves us in the right direction to say, because you have to accept risk, and obviously risk is about doing something where you don't know what the outcome will be. It may work, it may not work, but that's an inherent part of innovation. So it was good to hear leaders acknowledging that. And as someone summarized, and again, that's the quote I've included on the slide here, they said, you do what's needed and you won't be shot for doing it wrong because you had good intentions. And, gun violence aside, it's a nice illustration, I think, that, people are often understandably worried about what the consequences will be if they try something that doesn't work. And, it's a massive thing if you can make the people in your organization not feel so scared to try something new. And that was starting to emerge from some of the conversations that I had. And it made me wonder kind of about two implications of this innovation culture aspect. About, first of all, whether this level of risk tolerance was sustainable or not going forward. And that's really not something I can necessarily answer now, but it's something I just wanted to kind of put out there as a question really for us to ponder and reflect on. And also, does working from home, which a lot of people are doing, reduce the impact of an organization that's very risk averse? And the reason that I kind of ask or put that in as a reflective point was that a number of people did comment, a number of leaders did comment that they that they had previously felt quite constrained by the culture of their organization. And actually the fact that they were now working from home and basically were less influenced by the culture of their organization meant that they felt freer, actually, freer of the culture, and therefore freer of the risk aversion as well a little bit. So I did wonder whether there's something there about, working from home, you're physically removed from that environment, from the office, say, environment, for example, and therefore you're kind of psychologically removed from it as well a bit. So something for us to think about going forward. The last thing that kind of main discussion point really that emerged from the interviews that were conducted was that was this idea of what is the future going to look like, essentially. And again, perhaps unsurprisingly, we're talking about how COVID had impacted innovation within their organizations, but quite sensibly, a number of people wanted to comment on or wanted to talk about what they perceived the longer term impact to be. And the kind of things that I was hearing were things like, some of the previously nice to have aspects had suddenly become priorities, and crucially here were predicted to continue as priorities. So from a healthcare perspective, there was an integration of technology that was suddenly emphasized, but also, again, crucially here, was predicted to continue in that vein. So it wasn't a case of, it'll be emphasized now, but then it'll go back to how it was before. These were things that kind of future trends, basically, that these leaders were predicting in terms of innovation. The other thing that a number of people, a number of leaders were saying was that they were predicting that in the future, their organizations would retain that ability to innovate faster when needed, that their organizations would retain the ability to respond to sudden changes or surges in customer demand. And actually, they were very positive about that, about their organization's ability looking forward to maintain their competitive advantage, perhaps more effectively than they had necessarily done in the past. So there were a number of predictions around future innovation changes there that generally actually people were very positive about. And the last thing that really came out in terms of future innovation predictions was that organizations, to me anyway, they really seemed to have this desire to continue this increased collaboration, whether that was collaboration within their organization, but often also collaboration between organizations. And I think actually the people that I spoke with, they were most surprised about the positive impact of collaborating with a more diverse range of other organizations. So I think the leaders that I spoke with, they appreciated the fact that collaboration within their organizations had improved largely, but they weren't surprised, that was a good thing. They kind of, they knew that was a good thing if it could happen, and finally it happened. But what they were surprised about and also pleased about was that this, the positive benefits associated with working with other organizations. And that was something that they really wanted to continue. So they're the main kind of factors that emerged in terms of how organizations are changing how they approach innovation as a result of COVID. And in terms of looking forward then, I would say the concluding comments for me would be that there was a concern that the urgency and the opportunity for innovation and change will pass quite quickly. And although I don't know about you, but I guess for a lot of people, it feels like COVID has been going on forever in a way. From an organizational perspective, these leaders, they were concerned that opportunities for positive change would be lost essentially quite quickly. And so as a result, they were really keen to take time to reflect on how their organizations had responded to COVID, and basically assess, what was it they were doing they wanted to keep, and what was it they were doing that they didn't need to keep doing. And I think there are a number of organizations, I'm sure, doing that now. And actually quite a lot of people were doing that then as a result of me speaking to them, as they were saying that, it highlighted to them, it essentially forced them to spend some time reflecting on what had gone well and what hadn't gone well and what was important for them looking forward. So basically to do that process that essentially I was starting to do with them, to engage more with that, was something that that a number of people concluded that they wanted to do. And the kind of questions they wanted to ask them, they were asking themselves moving forward was, are they encouraging enough diverse collaboration within their organization and, between organizations as well? What kind of culture actually do they have? Could it change in some way? Do they need to foster certain aspects of an innovation culture, perhaps that they'd maybe neglected before or hadn't been able to emphasize before? Could they communicate in a different way, in a quicker way? And also, what were they doing to support these more radical ideas that they wanted to have and they wanted to support, but how could they best support them? But, overall, I think if we ask ourselves the question of, is COVID changing innovation? I mean, for me anyway, it's clear, yes, it has done. The question really is about, I would say at this point in time, the question is not about, is innovation changing innovation? Sorry, is COVID changing innovation? But the question actually is more about how can we keep those changes if we want to keep them? So how long term are the changes that we're seeing? And really what I would, I suppose, conclude with is that, yes, organizations are changing how they go about innovation now. But if we want to keep those changes, those positive changes, we need to be taking those active steps to make sure that we do that. Otherwise, I would predict, and people that I've spoken to have to some extent seen this already a little bit, there could well be a reversion to doing things as they were done before. So we need to make sure that we're taking advantage of those positive changes that we've now seen, because there has been a change. So can we continue to capitalize upon that, essentially? Okay, so I'm just conscious of the time, so I'm going to leave it there for now. Obviously, if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them now. And if you think of anything after the talk, you're welcome to email me as well. You've got my email address on the slide there. So Andreas, did you want to take over now? Should I stop sharing the slides?
Yes, please. That would be much appreciated, Anna.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Anna, for a very interesting talk on innovation under COVID. Perhaps we could all unmute ourselves, just give Anna a demonstration of our appreciation and a big clap for the talk. Much appreciated.
Thank you. That's very kind of you. I'm just going to try and turn my light on. Otherwise, it looks like I'm sitting in absolute pitch black.
Yes.
Which is probably not good.
No, but we're now coming to the Q&A session. So clearly, there's quite a few things in the chat room. But please feel free. You might always want to switch on the light, Anna, somewhat.
I know. I've tried. I've switched on one light. It's looking extremely atmospheric at the moment. Yes. I'm just going to turn on the other light instead. That might be better.
Now, I will obviously, you can unmute yourself now for the Q&A session. You can also show the video if you want, because we're quite a small group. So, I mean, you can obviously feel free to ask the question in person rather than me reading it out from the chat room. What is quite interesting, though, is as far as the themes are concerned, the government didn't seem to feature at all, which is quite interesting, given the unprecedented support that ostensibly the government has provided. But before we get started with the Q&A, Anna, Beria, I'm not sure whether that's pronounced properly, Beria, has actually made a very good point in the chat room, and actually said, what is meant by innovation? Do you have a definition of the innovation that you're talking about?
Yes, excellent question. Thank you. And as an academic, I should know better than to begin without a number of reference definitions. So don't tell my students that I did that. Yeah, so essentially we're talking about the implementation of new ideas. So we're talking about that process that starts with identifying an opportunity and generating new ideas, and then goes through a number of stages right through to when that idea is launched and implemented. So yeah, the implementation of new ideas is what we're talking about.
Okay. Okay. And Trevor, do you want to ask you a question about the research, or shall I ask it from the chat? There he is.
There I am. I just wondered when you actually did this research, because obviously that's quite important if you're looking at the effects of COVID, when you actually did the research in terms of the COVID situation now.
Yes, a good question, actually. So the majority of the people that I spoke with, I spoke to them in around September time. So we're talking about a few months ago now. So yeah, around September time, most of them.
So people were well into the COVID situation and had time, you thought, enough time to react, to think about how it was affecting in your case, innovation.
Exactly. And that was the difficult thing, as you say, with the timing, because you need to give people enough time to get used to the situation and to respond to it and to understand what's the new normal, to use that horrible overused phrase, for their organization. Yeah, so we're talking about September time mainly.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Nicholas Smith is asking a question in the chat room. Nicholas, do you want to ask it yourself, given that you're unmuted now?
I've just unmuted myself, Andreas. So hi, Anna. And
Hi,
my question cropped up when you were talking about radicalness, and I just wondered if there's any correlation between the findings of radicalness and organisational size. But I think the question also went to a lot of the themes, really, when I was listening to you.
It's a good question. To be honest, that in itself is an interesting finding, I suppose, that there actually wasn't that much correlation between organizational size and any of the themes. And that itself, as I say, I think is quite interesting, that actually the things that people, those 7 themes that were emerging, they were consistent regardless of organizational size, actually.
So no suggestion that smaller organisations use COVID to catch up with the big boys?
Funnily enough, not really. Like, in all honesty, and with the people that I spoke to, that wasn't what they were saying, actually. And there didn't seem to be that perception that they were trying to catch up. So no, actually, and that's something that I was maybe perhaps expecting there to be more influence about the size of the organization. But in all honesty, I can say that, the companies I spoke to with fewer than 10 people were reporting the same kind of challenges than the companies with over 100,000 people. Although I would put a caveat on that actually access to the NHS sometimes was a little bit different depending on the size of the organization. But beyond access to the NHS, apart from that, there was surprisingly actually not a lot of difference between what people said based on their organizational size.
Okay. Good. Lorelei actually asking interesting questions. Were they too busy firefighting, making necessary adjustments? I suppose, did you feel there was a transition in terms of innovative behavior from the beginning of the pandemic to when you did the interviews in September? Because, those had been going for quite a while. So could you sort of trace a different approach to innovation during that period?
Again, it's an interesting question, good question. There was definitely an element of firefighting, but I don't think that firefighting is inconsistent or incompatible with innovation. And actually a lot of the discussions that I had when people were talking about, changes they had made and innovation that they'd engaged with, some of those were firefighting activities. So I don't think it's actually, I don't think it needs to be one or the other. I don't think it's firefighting or innovation. I think a lot of the time it was innovation because they were firefighting, actually.
They were talking about
Okay.
Andreas, can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes, of course. Please go ahead, Lorelei.
It was just, thank you. It was just, Anna, to say that I think there's a difference between firefighting and planned innovation. And while a company might, in extremis, find itself able to respond quite quickly to change, it doesn't, well, I mean, apart from the fact that it may not be making the kind of right response, that there is a real difference between the kind of change that businesses are forced to do and the ongoing process of innovation that you might hope would be going on. I suppose it's a comment really rather than a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would agree with you. And perhaps some of the people that I spoke with, they were maybe overly optimistic, but there was definitely some optimism there from some of the leaders that I spoke with about whether their organization could continue to almost adopt that firefighting mindset to their more regular business activities surrounding innovation. And although that, as I say, that may be entirely unrealistic, perhaps, but you know, there were definitely people that were saying that that's what they would like to happen if possible. Although they were then also quick to acknowledge that, you know, a lot of their employees actually were very fatigued, and you know, that wasn't necessarily a long-term possibility. But there was a juxtaposition there of, you know, people were tired and it's an exhausting situation to be in, but there were so many benefits that they saw that they wanted to try and kind of replicate that environment constantly, but in a way that wasn't so detrimental to their staff, which may not be possible, but that was what they were saying they would like to do if they could work out a way of possibly doing that.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. I think we are sort of more or less sort of running out of the chat room, but Ben, you've raised your hand.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was complaining about my students not putting their videos and microphones on today, and then I realized I was hosting my own not following through, so I thought I better put it on. Thanks so much, Anna. It's extremely interesting talk. I was interested actually just in the level that you're talking to. You sound like you're talking fairly senior people, pretty much at kind of leadership level, who are, I guess, coordinating investments in strategic directions and so on for innovation. And so it was interesting that they were experiencing working remotely. I wondered whether there was any insight into the more frontline innovators in terms of the sort of backroom staff who were actually having to move forward, and whether they were still able to keep working on site, as it were, and push forward, or whether they noticed differences in that, the ability of people to move and kind of benefit from that sort of dimension. So I guess it was a kind of a level at which the analysis was being conducted. Obviously, interesting to hear from the senior level. Did they feel like they could detect anything happening at the more junior level overall?
Yeah, no, thank you, Ben. I mean, yes, it was, you know, I was talking to senior leaders primarily, so any comments that they made obviously were their perceptions of, you know, of what people at less senior levels were feeling and doing. I mean, there were definitely, because you mentioned working from home, there were definitely people on site, you know, that they were coordinating on production lines and things like that, and, you know, shipping products out and things. So, and there was a feeling that there was a lot of, was starting to be a lot of, you know, fatigue and exhaustion in that situation, with the people that were going, you know, physically to, for example, work on a production line, and, you know, with many more shifts than they perhaps had been doing before because there was such a rush to get products manufactured. So, yeah, but I think ultimately, you're right. In all honesty, I don't know exactly how those people were feeling because I just didn't talk to them, and any perceptions, you know, any data that I have is about senior leaders' perceptions of them, which in all honesty may or may not be accurate. So it would be interesting to do a follow-up study, Ben. Okay. There's always room for future research.
Like I guess I think a very interesting follow-up study would be what actually has come out of the innovation, in the sense in terms of the processes may be changing. Are they actually more effective or less effective than the old-fashioned way of, in sense, doing things overall? I mean, impossible to say anything on that until a couple of years' time, when perhaps we see what happened as a result of everyone having to adapt systems and so on? Did it inject a creative mindset in the first place, or has it actually led to a lull in the actual quality of innovations coming through? So very interesting questions.
But also, as you say, perception from different types of people as well. Because as I'm sure as you have as well, you speak to a lot of organizations and their leadership teams may tell you, they have an amazing innovation process, and then you talk to people on the ground, as it were, who are trying to implement it, and it's really not perceived in that way at all. So I think getting those different perspectives is a really good point.
Okay, one of the questions I have is, if I sort of summarized your research, I would say you found that everybody was the innovation approach by most businesses was broadly positive, but at the end you weren't sure as to whether this new approach to innovation would persist, or whether, given that we may find ourselves in a slightly different environment in the next months and years to come.
That's a very good summary. Yes, exactly that. And I think, some of the leaders, in fact, most of the people that I spoke with, they were concerned that, they had seen positive changes in their organization and they didn't want to lose those changes that they'd seen. And there was a real fear that things would just revert back to how they were done before. So yes, that's definitely, there's been positive change, there's been change, and some of that change has been positive. But there's a real separate effort now in terms of continuing that or not. Yeah.
And presumably that applies in all walks of life, not just in industry and the commercial world, but also in academia.
I couldn't possibly say. Yeah, no, it
will be interesting to follow that. Certainly. Okay, great. Does anybody else have any questions? Trevor, you've raised your hand.
Yes, I've got a sort of multi-point question. Sorry. Like any good researcher, of course, you didn't start off with any preconceived ideas about what the results were going to be. But were you disappointed in any way? Because it's not conclusive. There's a lot of different opinions, as you might expect. But were you disappointed, first of all, by the lack of consistency or the lack of some general conclusions? And the American work from the Harvard Business Review, etc., seemed to have some very definite conclusions. I haven't looked at that research, so I don't know whether they presented many different results. Did you do any were you able to do any sort of comparison with the research or the types of research? Yours was very focused on the healthcare industry, obviously. And the last part of the question, which really you mentioned, what about follow-up? Are you planning to do any sort of follow-up if and when we get through COVID and things get back to, sorry, I've got to use the word, back to normal?
Yeah. Okay, no, good, thank you. So I'll go through the parts one at a time. So in terms of lack of consistency, maybe I'm overly optimistic, but you know what? I actually didn't perceive it that way. I was certainly not disappointed, no, because given that before I did the research, I had no idea what was happening, seeing as I hadn't done the research yet. So personally, I was, just pleased to know, get a bit of an insight into what was happening. So I definitely wasn't concerned from that perspective. And actually, when I was feeding back to all of the organizations that participated, as a thank you to them for their time, they also, didn't perceive it very positively. So no issues there. In terms of the comparison is very interesting, because actually, I wouldn't say that the work, for example, from Boston Consulting Group and McKinsey, I actually don't think they found any greater levels of consistency than we did, for example, in this project. It may be, there's some difference between, I would imagine, between how consultancies and academics tend to present their findings. So there's, some of it I think is can be attributed to that. But no, I would say in identifying those 7 main themes, I was very pleased with. And actually, to me, that did show some consistency between the organizations I was speaking to. So that kind of made sense to me. But I totally agree with you in terms of follow-up. And also I think Ben mentioned something similar. So yes, I would love to follow it up. As you can imagine, access to organizations is, tricky, is a tricky thing. But yes, I would I'm planning to follow up with some of these organizations, because as you say, these are initial findings. And what's really interesting then is to understand the long-term impact of those changes that they've experienced.
And some difference between the way the Boston Consulting Group presents its results. Whoops. What is this?
Yes.
I lost everything.
No, you're there, Trevor. We can hear you.
Yeah. And so I'm just going to say some difference between the way the Boston Consulting Group presents its findings to the public, and some difference to the way you've been very honest with us tonight and told us about what the complete results were. I think there's always a difference, isn't there?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yes, there's always, and not that one is better than the other. They're just slightly different. They're for different audiences, audiences. So, and for different purposes.
I mean,
very diplomatic answer, yes.
One interesting question that raises for me, Anna, is when you follow up, are you looking to follow up quantitatively as well as qualitatively? Because clearly, you've got quite a nice cross break between different organizations, size, fields of industry, etc. But obviously, with 26 interviews, you cannot do many cross breaks, to be statistically valid. So, are you looking to follow up with some quantitative study as well?
Yeah, I mean, actually, my background is primarily as a quantitative researcher, so that's actually where I'm most comfortable. If you can hear the dog barking, he hopefully is agreeing with me. So yeah, primarily a quantitative researcher actually, so that would be my tendency to do that. But you know what, it depends actually what kind of access you can get, because if it's in a healthcare context, then I would be happy to go to quantitative next. But if it's in a different context, then I would want to, like a different industry, then I'd want to look qualitatively perhaps in the first instance, and then look quantitatively after that, because this is only focused on one context, really, one industry at the moment.
Yeah, okay, good. Well, listen, I mean, does anybody have another question? Otherwise, we'll draw things to a close for tonight. I think that means no. So once again, I mean, maybe who is currently on mute, if we could unmute ourselves once more and give Anna a round of applause, that would be much appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to start asking this after every lecture that I give. It's great.
Well, you see, I mean, some things shouldn't change, I mean, the problem with Zoom is that actually you lose something in Zoom sometimes, and it's certainly the interpersonal aspect is sometimes missed. And, as you know, when I press the button in a couple of minutes, everything just goes dead. There's no more walking up to the lecturer and having a chat and things like that, or going for a pint of beer or something. It all ends up very quickly. So I think it's nice to be multi-channel would be my future approach. Don't lose Zoom, but also do some stuff in the real world at Queen Square for BLSI. So thank you very much again, Anna. Before you go, I just want to let you know that next month on the 11th of May, it's Antonio Revilla from Bath Spa University giving a talk on I Will Survive. Good old Gloria Gaynor song, talking about the advantage of small business. And then in June, we have got Andrew Sturdy from Bristol University giving a talk on the governance and ethics of business consultancies. And that's on the 8th of June. The 11th of May. Not all lumps are once. There must be some business. I used to be a business consultant myself. I take umbrage at the fact that people are laughing now. Anyway, listen, as always, I hope to see you in May and I hope to see you in June. And as I always say at this juncture, stay healthy, stay safe, and most importantly, stay sane. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.